Being in the information technology business, I have had the opportunity to work with many different cultures in the workplace. Sometimes this led to confusion because I did not understand the social cues and cultural norms that shape the communication and behavior of my colleagues. This video is intended to talk about my journey in this area, with the hope that this will help others with their own journey. Because the IT industry is so heavily involved in doing offshore development, I thought that I would focus on my experiences with working with offshore vendors from India. First, let me say that understanding ourselves as Americans is something that we don't all take the time to look at. We don't think we need to because we believe that fundamentally we are all the same, right? Well, this propensity to look at how we are alike and how to disregard or ignore differences is something that we Americans do. It is part of our culture. Being somewhat isolated from other countries in the U.S., we also have less reason to pay attention to differences. This is called ethnocentricity. And we are not the only culture that thinks that we are the normal ones. The thing about being ethnocentric is that since we believe that we are normal, we believe that anyone who does not act in the way we do is abnormal. This results in perception and communication filters that get in our way of understanding what is really happening. Because we filter what we see and hear, we also make assumptions based upon our version of normal. And as you will see, our version of normal is not universal. Throughout this discussion, I will talk about American cultural biases and then talk about why these make it difficult for us to understand or to even hear what our Indian colleagues are trying to communicate to us. Before we talk specifically about American culture versus Indian culture, I'd like to introduce a concept called the Ladder of Inference. The Ladder of Inference describes how we have a natural tendency to jump to conclusions when we don't fully understand a situation. The way this works is we observe something, we see data or have an experience. From that we filter and select a portion of what is observable and what we notice. We then add meaning to that filtered observation. This added meaning often comes from our cultural beliefs of what is normal. We then make assumptions to fill in any gaps so that we can fully understand our experience. From there we draw conclusions about our experience. These conclusions then get filed away or added to our store of beliefs about the world. We then act based upon our conclusions and beliefs. You can see that a lot happens between our observing the experience or receiving the data and our acting on it. While this may all happen in seconds, there is a lot of manipulation we do in order to create what we believe to be an understanding of the event or the information received. So let's see how this ladder of inference may come into play when we interact with another culture, in this case our offshore partners. In American culture, we like to say that everyone is created equal, and everyone has an equal opportunity to be successful in life. We also have more informal relationships at work with managers and subordinates. They call each other by first names, and there is also the expectation that the relationship is more of a partnership than a hierarchy. This is very different from India, where they have a formal caste system, and where it is normal to show formal respect and to defer to superiors and elders. In America, we value independence and individuality. That means when we speak to one another, we are interested in communicating our point of view, and our overriding goal is to exchange information. In India, the family and the community is valued above the individual. In India, they speak to each other with an eye to create and strengthen relationships. You can see where this can lead to a difference in what is said and what is not said. In America, we enjoy a good debate or exchange of differing ideas. In India, this might be seen as a conflict and would therefore be avoided. When I started working with offshore teams, I assumed that they would be participative in the calls and want to speak up and be heard. What I encountered was silence and short, agreeable answers. I jumped right up the ladder of inference and assumed that they had nothing to say because they either had no thoughts around the matter or did not care. I formed a belief that the team wanted to be just indifferent hired hands, so I stopped asking them to provide feedback. The reality was that I was just expecting them to be acting like Americans, and I was not following the right protocol to get their thoughts. First, I was a client, and therefore as their perceived superior, they were deferring to me and being respectful. Also, by asking them directly for feedback, I was asking them to be disrespectful to their manager. Once I figured out to go through their manager to get their feedback, I got feedback in spades. There are other common interactions that can be misunderstood. Take, for instance, the word yes. In America, this is a word signifying agreement or even commitment. In India, this means uh-huh or I am listening. Other words Americans may mistake for agreement are sure, fine, okay, no problem. These are only spoken to be polite. They should not be seen as agreement or commitment. I can tell you that there have been many times I have gone up the ladder of inference and made the mistake of thinking that this response meant that we had agreement on how to move forward, and I was only frustrated later when something did not happen as I expected. I would get further aggravated when the response from my Indian partner was one of confusion, as if we never had agreement. I have again climbed the ladder of inference and mistakenly interpreted this as being passive-aggressive, dishonest, or I've even thought that my colleague must have a terrible memory or was not listening to me. If you think yes is tricky, now let's talk about no. When I want to tell my boss or peer that I can't do something, I say no, and I explain why. When I ask my Indian colleague to do something, and he says, "Is that what you would like?" and I say, "Yes," and he says, "I understand," I think he just agreed. But in reality, he was just making polite conversation and never really actually agreed. Indians are always looking to keep social harmony and communicate to preserve and strengthen relationships. Saying no is seen as causing disharmony and friction. You will instead find yourself in a situation where your Indian colleague will not say no, but instead might keep changing the subject to avoid having to say no. Or he might ask you what you think, or if you think it can be done. Or you may have the answer deferred with a polite, "Let me check with my team," which will often lead to my personal favorite, "no answer at all." The no answer at all is especially dangerous if you rely on email and have the habit of believing that when you send an email you can forget about it until you get a response. Well, don't. If your colleague doesn't agree with you or can't do as you ask, then it is likely that you won't get a response. By the way, like saying no, negative feedback can be inferred by lack of response. If you send something expecting feedback and your colleague has negative or corrective feedback for you, then you will likely never hear it. Again, no feedback is probably an indicator of negative response. Other ways you might get negative feedback without actually getting it is if your Indian colleague changes the topic when you ask about it, if your Indian colleague asks what you thought about your proposal or work, or your Indian colleague gives specific praise to a specific part of the work, or of course a deferral. Let me ask the team what they thought. Another thing that I have found odd is that when I ask one of my Indian colleagues what he or she thinks, it seems like I have to drag it out of them. I may initially get the response, "What do you think?" If I fall into that trap and jump up the ladder of inference, assuming that she has no thoughts, then I'd better be happy with only hearing my own opinion. Remember, since your Indian colleague wants to create a positive interaction, he or she will probably want to find out what you think first so that he or she can support it and ask more about what you think. So what does all this mean? It means that we make assumptions that other people behave, act, and interact the same way we do. This leads to misunderstandings and sometimes frictions because we think we hear one thing and we set our expectations accordingly, and then we are surprised and sometimes frustrated when our expectations are not met. On the other side of the coin, the same thing is happening. Our Indian partners just walked away with a completely different expectation and a completely different interpretation of what should happen. My advice is first, be aware of this difference and to accept it as real. Once you do, I hope that the frustration level will diminish and the desire to find a path forward toward better communication will unfold. I found that once I understood these differences and accepted them as different and valid ways of being, I was far more equipped to begin communicating effectively. Looking at the differences with appreciation and curiosity allows us to stop filtering based upon negative emotional responses and to open ourselves up to being more observant and more capable listeners and communicators. Once I began to think differently about communication with my offshore partners, I found that there was a willingness to discuss these differences and a joint desire to find ways to bridge them. I hope that this discussion has helped you see things a little differently and will help you start building your own bridges. If you'd like more information on cultural differences, here's just a few references.